But this week's rock star is Mark Noppé from SRK Consulting. So Mark is a leader in the mining and geoscience consulting industry. He provides technical advice in all aspects of ore body knowledge. And I'm so grateful that he could join us today to chat with us about robust governance processes. So thank you so much, Mark, for joining us. And it's wonderful to have you.
Right, hopefully that's come up. So welcome everyone. That's a bit of a hard gig to follow after Daniel, and I must admit I'm tempted just to jump to the last slide and go get a glass of wine or a beer. So I'm sure other people feel the same way. But in order to earn that glass of wine or that beer, Jessica said I've got to sing for it. So this is what I'm going to talk to you about today. It's a little bit of a dry topic, but for me, I think it's quite important for those of us in the geoscience and mining industry. So there's a topic, quite obviously what it is. It's about governance processes to provide assurance on the resources and reserves that we generate and report. So I'm going to talk through what does it mean, what does it look like, what could it look like, and see if I can share some of the things that I've learned over time. So we'll talk about what do I mean by assurance, why improve it, like is it really broken? If we are going to improve it, how would we do that? What do we mean by the terms peer review and audit? So what do they mean to different people? Because those terms will pop up. Provide a few examples of what some industry companies are doing, and then round that up. So let's have a look at what we mean by assurance in this space. So the reason that we want to look at assurance in the space of resource reserves is to mitigate risk. And the risk here is around the technical matters of reporting on our key assets, which are our mineral resources and our ore reserves. So they're the key assets of the companies that we work for or work with. And we need assurance, obviously, that the work that's been done, the processes, how we're doing the work, is being done adequately, correctly, effectively. And we need to assess and manage any risk that our resource or reserves might be incorrectly defined or incorrectly reported. So that's what we're trying to protect against and provide assurance for. Because any incorrect generation and reporting or use of those numbers can make a big difference in decision making or investment, and also then reputation damage to that company and or our industry in general, so affecting investor confidence. So in order to manage risk, one of the things that those involved in risk management talk about are the controls. So we need to have controls in place to protect against the risk of incorrect reporting, incorrect generating of the resource reserve estimates, and incorrect reporting ultimately. So that can occur in different areas. It could be data collection, interpretation, the way that we estimate, or even in preparing the final reports we do and the way that we collate them. So very important that we look to get that right. And a specialist in risk management here at the time he was at the University of Queensland, Jim Joy, his comment was that the level of risk is determined by the quality of controls. The better quality and the better application of the controls you have in place, the better you manage that risk. So I thought that's an interesting comment to relate it back to what do we mean by the controls in place. So if we look just briefly in this introduction at resource reserve assurance, R&R assurance process, what does it provide if it's in place? So one of the things at a high level is it supports corporate governance, which is basically giving the board, the senior management and the board, and then ultimately the investors or the stakeholders, assurance that we're doing the right thing in the right way. And what do we mean by that? Well, we're looking to ensure and provide assurance that the accuracy of the results that we generate and report are believable. And it comes with an added benefit that I'll talk to again later, is that in following through with these processes around assurance, these controls, we actually there are added benefits around providing knowledge sharing between people in the business or people outside and inside the business. I mean, obviously that builds capacity and provides and identifies opportunities for improvement. So rather than simply thinking of something like this as some kind of stick looking for errors, looking for fault. We're actually looking to share knowledge, improve the way things are done, so that we have this continuous improvement out of it. And when we look at resource reserve assurance, as a geologist myself and working with data and numbers in my earlier career, I was right into the technical detail. Give me the numbers and I'll work through them, think about them, crunch them, estimate, report them. And it was all about the technical detail. But in fact, if you step back from that, most resource reserve assurance processes or systems step a little higher up and they say, well, look, if we have the right people doing the right work, in other words, the right processes, using the right tools, which are the systems, so right people, right processes, right systems, all the way through that chain of information, then we are more likely than not going to end up with accurate outcomes and repeatable outcomes. And that's what we're looking for, that we examine and we look at the people, the processes, the systems, and are they working adequately, effectively? Are they designed and working as intended to get a good outcome? So let's have a look at why one would want to improve resource reserve assurance. So I don't think I need to necessarily spend much time with the audience that we have talking about that mining is inherently a risky business. It's not manufacturing. We don't order in our raw materials. We dealt with what nature provides for us. So in order to explain that to stakeholders, investors, it's important that the market, those stakeholders, receive transparent, consistent, and balanced information from us about the data, about the confidence, about where's the project at in its development timeline. So that's really important. And in our mining chain, I mean, there's risks and opportunities at every layer, from different stages of exploration through to identifying a potential project, through to constructing and operating that mine. There's risk at all of those stages. And I quite like this diagram up here, the sort of triangle or pyramid, depending on how you want to look at it, because what we have down at the bottom is basically the foundation or the basis is that geological, geoscientific engineering information that leads from our geological knowledge to our resource, to our reserve, our mine plan, ultimately those resource and reserve estimates, which then get used to identify potential revenue and ultimately then profitability. And of course, more and more, and very focused now, I've wrapped that pyramid with the social, environmental, and governance related environment, if you like, the overall environment in which we operate, the landscape. So SEG is the summary acronym you see and hear, and all of what we do technically still lives within a social, environmental, and governance framework to ensure basically as responsible as possible investment and operation of mining projects. I just wanted to, that's a bit of a small text, but I wanted to show you an example of when things go wrong, right? So this is a statement out of Anglo American's public report a few years ago now, but they actually admitted to an error. And I've highlighted that on that page there. They uncovered 2 errors from one year to the next that they thought were so significant that they wanted to actually report them publicly. And after I saw this, I went looking at other companies' annual reports. I thought, I wonder how often you see the word error occur in a public statement or in an annual report. And I can tell you that looking at several companies' annual reports, I couldn't find that word error anywhere else. Just to put that in context, the error there, they said, led to an overstatement of 30 million carats, that's diamonds. And 30 million carats for them is probably in the order of at $200 a carat, and you got 30 million carats, you can see that's a big number, right? So potentially a big issue, and they put it out in the public domain. And you don't want to do that, right? Reputation damage, a lot of gnashing of teeth, inward navel gazing. So when people are asked about why do these errors occur, or why aren't there better controls to potentially prevent these things happening from time to time, some of the reasons people give for inaccurate reporting in our resource reserve space are some of these: too few staff, too little time, not experienced people doing the work. If they are experienced person, why aren't they adequately mentored, monitored, peer reviewed? So that comes down to oversight. Perhaps there isn't a repeatable process. We had that topic there: people, processes, etc. And the other one, of course, is it may just be that the culture or the governance framework which in the company operates, they simply don't have that overarching framework of recognizing that they need technical governance and assurance over our resource reserve processes to the same way that they have that over other business activities like legal or environmental or financial. So let's have a look at how one would look to improve resource reserve assurance if it's not already in place. So the insurance process must manage the risk that there could be incorrect generation or reporting of resource reserves. And we need it over those key areas that we spoke about before: data collection, the way we estimate, the way that we report. So it covers quite a number of activities. This diagram sort of suggests where in the organization's layers or hierarchy are there requirements for improved governance or improved assurance. So at the bottom of that triangle, I've got the practitioner. So this is where the work happens. This is where the experts or the technical specialists, etc., are doing the work, generating the estimates. The next layer, this blue one, is basically oversight or monitoring or supervision, however you'd like to do it. So when that work is reported up the line, who's actually keeping an eye on how it's done, how it's reported, how it's going to be used, where are the next layer of sign-off, if you like. And then ultimately, some of that information makes its way through to the public domain, gets summarized, collated, reworded, and used for external reporting. And that's what the market and the external market sees. So again, we need to make sure that that's correct. So I said earlier, all companies actually have governance clearly in place over legal, financial, typically environmental related matters, but not all have that clearly defined around our exploration results, our data, our mineral resources, our ore reserves, or indeed our mine reconciliation. And one of the important statements that I think people need to consider, that if a company does not have a clear process of resource reserve assurance or governance in place, then how do they disclose to their stakeholders that they have an adequate oversight of these technical matters to result in accurate results? So if they don't have that in place, they should be transparent about how do they provide that layer of control. So we'll see some examples later where people describe what it is they do in this space. I just wanted to share with you, coming from a technical background myself as a geologist, what I was introduced to is that obviously in these other areas of legal, financial, other parts of business activities, there's a function called internal audit in many companies, and definitely the mid-tier to the majors definitely have these. And typically there's internal audit function somewhere in the business. And there's an institute of internal auditors, so that's exciting, I thought, and their documents are even drier to read than some of ours. But they have an interesting model. They call it the 3 lines of defense. And what they talk about is that much like that diagram I showed earlier with the 3 layers, they talk about an operational management control as a first line of defense. So are there controls in place where the work is happening? The next one is oversight functions, which in the diagram I had earlier is that middle layer. So what is the oversight on the work that's taking place, and to ensure that it's been done as planned and delivered as expected? And then there's a third layer of defense, which is called here, which is a form of independent assurance from people not directly involved in the tasks or activities to oversight those first and second items I mentioned and make sure that they are in place and working as intended. So in this diagram, if you think about it, again, the first line of defense would be where the work happens. The second line would be that supervision or oversight. And the third line would be this higher level top-down look. And this is the kind of thing that you would expect to see. The first line of defense is, there'll be peer review, there'll be checks and balances, there'll be people making sure that their totals work. There'll be a number of things that people do to ensure that their work is being done correctly. And then that second line of defense, as I say, is more the oversight. It's the review meetings, higher levels. It's making sure that there's some procedures or standards and operational controls in place. And then that third layer is a much higher, as I say, independent overview of the entire process. So typically one looks for elements of this based on the directions of the Institute of Internal Auditors. And if you've got these elements in place, then you typically would then have a robust resource reserve system or assurance process. So previously now we're mentioning the terms peer reviews and audits, and I just thought I'd cut and paste a few things from our world, which is, this is coming out of the JORC code, which this year's under review, most of you would know. But in the table 1 at the back of the JORC code, there are 3 places where simple questions are asked, as simple as I've cut and pasted there. Audits and reviews, basically the question is, have there been any, and what was the outcome around data collection, the mineral resource estimate, and the ore reserve? So the question's being asked, and you don't often see a lot of commentary and text about what's been done when you read public reports, but it's been asked. What's been done? And the whole point is to provide additional layers of assurance on the work you did. You might be brilliant at what you do, but who else has looked at it? Where's the second, a second person on the team, perhaps a layer of independence to cross-check, double-check, ask the tough questions. So when we look at why have peer review or audit processes, the typical things that pop up are those on the screen, compliance, assurance, when you're doing due diligence, when you're assessing the value of something, you're conducting technical, in our world, if we're technical experts, technical peer reviews or technical audits. But there's more to it than that as well. If we can demonstrate that we're doing this well, then we can improve market perception, we can protect against potentially fraudulent activities, and better understand risk. And the third grouping that in conducting peer reviews and audits, which we'll talk about a little later, is that the benefit I mentioned earlier in the presentation is it allows us to identify improvement opportunities, things we hadn't thought of, because there's another layer of experience looking over what's been done, perhaps with a little bit arm's length, and asking some questions from a different perspective. So identifying improvements and sharing knowledge and skills, I said. So there's added benefits from running these processes in terms of knowledge transfer. So this is just repeating what we said. The overall objective of peer review and audits within a assurance system is to check on the level of accuracy, provide assurance that that's been done as well as can be expected. And then in addition, as I say, it provides some other opportunities. The important thing with these processes, they recognize that fundamental importance of resource reserve within our resource company's asset base. And as I say, it identifies other opportunities for improvement beyond just the technical work that's been done. So good outcome. So I thought I might just unpack from my point of view how I see the difference between a peer review and an audit, and how some of the clients that I work with and we work with see it themselves. So what's the difference between a peer review or an audit? So typically a peer review is seen by many as a review activity that happens concurrently with the activity being done. So if you're a geologist preparing for resource estimation, you're reviewing the data, you're deciding which data is appropriate to use in the resource, and that's a decision point as to, all right, now I'm going to use the data. So a peer review at that stage would be to look over your shoulder and say, I can see how you got to this database, to this particular data, why this data is acceptable. Show me, did you think of this? Did you think of that? So it's concurrent. There's an opportunity to improve, repeat something if it needs to before you do the next activity. So concurrent allows improvement in real time while that activity is being done. And typically you're drilling down into the numbers and outcomes. Generally, an audit is carried out a little differently. An audit is generally carried out when the activity is finished. So you've actually now finished estimating, for example, your resources or your reserves. You've got your summary reports, and now you look backwards at the whole process and say, well, let me look backwards retrospectively. What did you do? Not what are you doing? What did you do? And basically, therefore, it may identify gaps in what was done. It's too late to fix those now, but it identifies what you can do, should do, or must do to improve it the next time round. So it's backward looking to improve the future. And in line with my earlier simple slide, it typically is a slightly higher level than verification of the numbers. It may include verification. It depends on the definition of the audit scope, but it's typically looking at the right people, doing things the right way, using the right tools effectively. So those are the two differences in the way some companies use those terms. So just look at that audit again, or sometimes a governance audit. So it's looking at the quality of the controls in place. I mentioned that earlier. It's looking at what controls, what checks and balances are in place. And importantly, it's saying, are they adequate for what you're doing? If they're adequate, are they actually being effectively carried out? And that point there, are they carried out as intended, which is compliance. And that's really important too. If any one of those fail, then there's something wrong. You could have a great set of controls, they're not being followed. What's the point? You could have what appear to be a good set of controls not necessarily done, but not necessarily well, and they're ineffective in meeting the objective. So the whole purpose of that audit, as I say, is to review those people, process, systems, the controls that are in place, and recommend improvements going forward. And these provide recommended actions, priorities typically, and get reported up to internal audit committees, depending on the severity of the outcome of an audit. A peer review, which I think is a critical part of our process, is literally peer reviewing what somebody else is doing next to you, is really important. Internal confirmation the work's been done correctly. That might be internal, it might be external. And it allows improvement, knowledge share. So really important process, peer review, separate to audit. And I say that it's generally somebody else who knows a lot about what you're doing, because it's looking a little deeper at how you're doing your job. You can choose where those peer reviewers come from, internal or external, depends on your needs and the credentials and experience you're looking for. And I mentioned before, it's concurrent. Earlier on, I put a slide up. If it's not been done, why has it not been done? And we just looked at some of those reasons around people and time, and etc. But this is another way to look at it. When we talk about peer reviews or technical audits, there's still a sense in some areas where people are not used to this being done, where it's not in their normal day's work, where they're nervous or suspicious about having their work looked at by somebody else. It's really interesting, and peer review is generally more acceptable than audit, because audit is something that gets reported upward in the company typically. So audits create a lot of backpedaling and defensiveness. Several years ago, the author of a paper there, Leo de Lange, he made a comment, and he was an internal auditor for one of the large mining houses. He made that comment that the assurance systems of the companies that he worked with, he reviewed, he was surprised at the lack of resource and reserve information been covered in those technical governance processes back at that time. The other question here is just another answer at a higher level about why should we have these assurance processes that include peer review and or technical audit, and why do we need them to be applied more consistently across our industry? And again, from Leo's paper, his comment there, stakeholders, which are both senior management and our investors, external, are increasingly more interested in the non-financial aspects of the business. What's happening, where's the data come from, and of course now put on top of the technical, the ESG, environmental, social, governance matters. We all are very aware how that's become more and more relevant and public in the last couple of years. So just a couple of quick examples. This is an example from Rio Tinto. They put this in a paper at a conference several years ago, but one could identify, when one looks at their description of their process, these 3 levels of control. They basically had a all-reserve steering committee in place. They had an executive committee at a higher level within the business, and ultimately these fell under the board audit committee. So the layers 2 and 3 up here were clearly identified, and by implication, but not necessarily described in that paper, is below these layers, they were looking at how the work was being done. That was the subject of their oversight, was this level 1. So they provide that quite clearly, and you'll find it in their websites, their annual reports, a description of not their 3 levels of defense, I don't call it that, but you can see those elements. These are 2 busy slides, but just cut and paste the kind of text that you see from other companies. The top one is Goldfields, and that's from their annual report, basically saying that they have a process of estimation on an ongoing basis, both internally and cyclically by external and independent experts. They embed processes by third-party reviews, expert independent assurance, blah, 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 blah. Newcrest, this one on the left, also from the annual report. So they have in place a steering committee. The purpose of the committee is as follows. They talk about their guideline procedures, etc., their controls. They talk about external standards. They talk about external reviews and internal assessment of processes. So they describe in what it is they do in their own world to provide comfort that the work is being done to provide assurance over resource and reserve. So we see this in a range of companies. I could have put up several at the drop of a hat. So just rounding up as it approaches Thursday clock here in Brisbane, this quote I put up a little earlier. So basically those examples I provided earlier was companies disclosing, albeit at a high level, that they have an assurance process in place to provide oversight and assurance on the accuracy of the work being done in their resource and reserve space. Companies that can't provide that and don't should be asked how they provide that assurance. And the reason for that for me, and this is a diagram I like to use, is when we're looking at these processes at a level 1 or 2 or 3 for resource reserves, what we're looking to see is that each step in the process, from data to interpretation to estimation to reporting to public reporting, there aren't any weak links in that chain, in that information flow, because any weak link is potentially defines the strength of the entire chain of data and information, right? You're only as strong as the weakest link. That example I put up earlier with the Anglo-American annual report, I'd have to go back and see what they say there about the cause, but they identified it right down to a very simple calculation error by one person in a spreadsheet doing a process for the first time that they'd not done before. Nobody checked it. There was no oversight, and it resulted in, a reputational concern that led to the annual statement of errors in their process. So just in conclusion and a wrap up, a resource reserve assurance system generally has staged evidence of reviews and audits. So from that level 1 to level 2 to level 3 are lines of defense. And what it's looking at are the controls in place. And the reason you're doing this is to provide independent and objective assurance overall in terms of the company's reporting of resource reserves and statements. The one thing that it does encourage, because it's part of what you're looking for, are those controls that are adequate, effective, remember, and that it means if they're in place and followed, the processes have been captured and are repeatable, which is important, right? We could have a good person doing great work, but if they're not there next year, the same work wouldn't be done. So that's really important. The systematic and disciplined processes that are effective provide that risk management. And then ultimately, the reason we're doing this work is to provide assurance. And typically that assurance is right up to the senior company management, that basically when they put out statements, use the data, it supports their financial projections. If they were to be asked, how do you know that this data is reliable? They could go back to their technical management, their audit committees, and work through the process of how assurance has been provided right through from data collection to final reporting. And I've seen companies do that where senior management have been asked to sign off on the summary resource reserve statement that's going to go in the annual report. That senior management has turned around to his head of technical and said, well, before I put my signature here, what do you do to convince yourself that the numbers you've given me are adequate? Because I'm not signing my name on this without knowledge. And that person then is able to say, well, we do the following. We've got evidence of it. We've got the outcome from reviews. We can demonstrate that we're doing the best we can to monitor and that the controls in place are working adequately, effectively, and that we are as sure as we can be that the numbers are as accurate as we can get them this year. So that's the example. And Jessica, that's it.
Thank you so much. I've had a couple of questions coming through. So are there any differences between how juniors and the majors handle R&R assurance or risk in general? And also what is considered material error for both cohorts?
Oh, cool. Two different questions. So that's an interesting thing, right? The junior companies and the smaller mid-tiers, they say, oh, we're small, we can't do this. The big companies can afford to have these layers of control. But in fact, at the smallest scale, and, I can think back to working for small companies or doing work for small companies, in the work that you do as an individual, what are your checks and balances? Can you show somebody? Do you have the backup? So those are your level 1 controls as an individual. It's not unusual, as many of you would know, that depending on how your work's going to be used, that you request an independent person to peer review you. If you're providing the work internally and you don't have an internal technical peer reviewer, it should be it should be quite acceptable to management if they believe in this, the need for assurance, and they should, for them to pay a small amount of money to get in an external reviewer. I mean, typically in our world of consulting, that peer review process might only add as little as 5% to the cost or time of a job, depending on the kind of work being done. Could be 10%. It's a small fraction to provide that second opinion, if you like. It's almost like having two people doing the same job by having that independent peer review. So if you've got that in place and you're always reporting the numbers through to someone, right? There's another layer that's receiving it, even in a small company, even if it's, you're doing the work and it's, one of the directors who's or non-technical or technical directors or non-exec directors. There's somebody who can provide that second or third layer. You might not get to that full third layer of defense where it's an independent audit and you don't have internal audit. But the key thing is do you have very strong level 1 controls and can you show them? So I hope that helps. And as companies get more robust, it gets better. I've worked with a couple of companies, small and one operation, for example, one mine, or developing one mine, and they've recognized they need to get this in place, because as they begin reporting, building, developing, they want to have a system that works consistently for them for all of the reasons I've just described. So start small, get the elements in place. Materiality, if I understood the question correctly, is it comes down to, we're saying that we put this in place to protect against the potential for incorrect generation or reporting of our resource reserves. So I think the question was, well, what would be considered material? Look, I'll share the guidance that comes out of ASIC and the ASX, for example, because we don't generally see it repeated in some of our technical guidance. But generally, people say that if a change, if a change resulted in more than a 10 to 15% difference, and in fact, it's normally a difference in the value, but of course, simplistically, if you change your metal content in your estimate by 10 to 15% and you do a straight value calculation, you could argue that there's your 10 to 15%. But generally, it's about the potential for it to drive a change in the value of the project or the company by that level of amount would be considered material, or it could be reputational. So sometimes it might not be material, but it might be highly reputational, and for that purpose, I think it could be deemed material. So different ways to look at materiality. The other thing is, if you start having a company with multiple assets or mines or exploration projects, one might be small and the others might be large. And so you as a say the geologist or the competent person for that smaller project might say, look, I've had a 30-40% change in this because, we made an error, or we got the interpretation wrong, or, new data suggests that it's a difference and we haven't told the market or something. However, in the scheme of all of the resource reserves for our deposit, for our mines, for our company, that one asset is immaterial. Now, that might well be the case, but my recommendation is as a technical person on the project, you shouldn't make a decision of what's material at a company level. You should make a decision at your level of, I think this is important, I need to elevate and report it up the line, and other people can make the decision if it's material from a public reporting point of view.
So peer review may not involve checking the numbers, and the audit does not check the numbers. So who then checks the numbers, which are the window of the company's assets?
Yeah, so I think what I said earlier is that peer review typically does verify the numbers, but audit doesn't unless it's specified in the scope. So the peer review is normally checking closely enough that they can verify the process and the numbers. I mean, some people include in their peer review process and or their audit, they actually say we want an independent re-estimate. But that's not always what's asked for. Often it's a case of we want you to review the steps, processes, individual outcomes, and comment on those. So yes, there is verification generally at a peer review, and at an audit, at these governance audits, not normally unless specifically requested as part of the audit scope. Yeah.
Yep. Okay.
I just wanted, can I do a Dorothy Dick? So Joe asked about sampling. a little, I guess, personal interest of mine right now is when we do samples for grade, right? So we basically take our samples, we split them down, we put them through the preparation lab, then they go for an assay. We get an assay back that we expect to be representative of this primary sample we took. But of course, that sample has been subsampled all the way down the chain until it got assayed, right? So we've got samples of samples of samples, and the final assay represents the original, let's say, 1 meter RC length or sticker core we did. But they're all samples of samples that carry some form of error. So each one is an estimate of what we think the truth is. And we call those sample grades. We might composite them to longer length and call them composite grades. And then ultimately, with whatever estimation technique we use, we estimate them into, typically block models or larger volumes, and then we'll call them model grades, or we'll give them a term that relates to the larger rock mass. With density and bulk density, we typically do the same thing. We take, for example, sticks of diamond core, which might be 15, 20 centimeters long. We typically do a water immersion, and we get a density. Now that's a density of the sample we took with the method we used to test it, right? But we tend in our industry to call those bulk density from the start. We say the bulk density is this. And from my point of view, I would like us to be using the word sample density, because that's what it is. We took a sample, we determined a density on a sample. Once we got all our sample data in and assessed whether there's a bias and how we did the assay and whether we've missed some broken rock and pore spaces and voids, we'll make a decision on how to report that or estimate that for the bulk density of the units or the rock domains or whatever it is that we're estimating. And then it becomes the estimated bulk density. So it's just my little bugbear. Our densities are sample densities until such time as we provide an argument why they can be used as an estimate for bulk density, the same way we do for assays. And the other one with samples is, remember, density is as important as an assay, and the density we report for our models should be dry densities. Our samples are typically, I'm not saying for every type of deposit, but typically our assay grades are dry grades, moisture removed through the drying process. Our densities should be at the same moisture basis as our assays, because we take volume times density tonnage. The tonnage needs to be dry tonnage at the same level of moisture, the same dryness as our assays, because we take tonnage times assay grade gives me metal. If you've not got the same moisture basis in your density sample, and or you haven't corrected for pore space, then my story is you become an alchemist and create metal from water or air. So just my little rant.
So thank you very much for sharing with us. And thank you everyone for coming. I hope you all have a wonderful weekend, and see you again next time.
Thank you. And thanks for those great questions. Wonderful.